Hi, everybody. Welcome to our third webinar here at Kayagene's webinar series. This is how to avoid costly cultivation mistakes with Steven Czaplewski. So some of the things that were learned on the East Coast, the West Coast, in terms of everything from planning to sourcing to all the above. And Steve will kind of give you a breakdown on what we're going to talk about here in a little more detail. But first, we'll give you a little intro to our company, Kayagene, and ourselves. So Kayagene is a high cannabinoid breeding and seed company out of Salinas, California, right here in the heart of California's Ag Valley. What we do is really focus on breeding high cannabinoid, high terpene varieties for the various markets that exist in the industry. We can talk to what those markets are here and some of this and how to plan things. And I'm the director of product portfolio at Kayagene. I'm an agronomist and a hemp specialist based on what we've learned over the last couple of years in hemp and over several years of just cannabis knowledge. We have identified the different growing seasons and just some general breeding strategies to help get this crop to where it needs to be. Some of my background exists in commercial agriculture. I have a degree in agronomy and have worked in vegetable operations and floriculture operations, and have kind of found what kind of problems growers encounter when growing to scale and when trying to attempt national and when trying to attempt entering national and international markets. And then I'll pass the introduction on to Steve, and he's our head of product evaluation here at Kayagene.
Hey, hello everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar. It's a real pleasure to get a chance to talk to you today. And my name is Steve Czaplewski, head of product evaluation. I have a pretty long background in the commercial seed business, particularly in vegetables, being both a breeder, agronomist, and deeply involved in trialing. And so some of those things I'll be bringing into this discussion today. Okay, some of the topics and how we're going to address this whole issue of how to avoid costly cultivation mistakes is to identify some of the sources of problems, both before the crop, during the crop, and after the crop. But, in the point of view that we're looking for answers, prevention by planning and getting more information and knowledge, and of course, knowing your market are keys to dealing with these issues. Okay, the first slide I have here is choosing the right seed supplier. So this is going way before you start your crop. This is something you really want to spend the time looking into. And so there's several ways of going about this. And that is, first, let's start with asking questions, because you know that if the implications, if you do not have a good seed supplier, you're going to run into issues that we saw with many other growers, that being, lack of adaptation of the variety you may pick, not proper feminization, poor germination, no follow-up and things like that. And these things, we don't ever like to see. So asking questions, and one of the first questions you might ask are, is this company got experienced seedsmen? That's an interesting question, because, what is a seedsman? So a seedsman is not somebody who just can produce seed, but rather somebody who really knows how to maintain varietal purity and consistency over years, so that if you come back and you want to buy the same variety that you grew, say, 3 years ago, it's going to be exactly the same. It's not going to have changed in any way, shape, or form. Also, a good seedsman not only knows, how to produce seed, where to produce it, in order to get the very best quality of seeds. In addition, after the harvest of the crop, they know how to best handle the crop and condition it in order to maintain seed viability, vigor, germination, and overall quality. A seedsman like ourselves, considers ourselves customer focused. We just are one point in the whole process of bringing, seed as a seed all the way up to a commercial crop and deliver that to the end customer. And in addition, a good seedsman will know how to deal with the whole concept of seed certification. What are the implications and those sorts of things? So a good seedsman, knows all of these things and puts them into play to support the growers. Another question, you might want to ask, and which is very important, is does your seed supplier do grow outs. Now, you might ask, what is a grow out? Not everybody does them. It's not legally required in the seed business. You can produce seed and send it. But with a grow out, what you're doing is taking some of the seed of what was just recently produced in a seed lot, growing it out to a decent sized scale in order to look for any kind of anomalies in the material. You know, is the variety true to type? You know, was the vigor proper? Is the potency correct? Is it compliant? Are there any other off types, any issues? Feminization, is that proper? You know, this is important prior to the sale so that you can mitigate any of the risks going to the grower in a case like this. And this is something that we do routinely, and we are very proud of this fact because it allows us to stand apart from others who don't necessarily take the opportunity to do it. You know, there are many sources of, you know, where problems could occur. You might say, well, you know, the field looked good, I didn't see any problems, you know, I think we're good to go. But, you know, you can get pollen floating in, you can have some potential seed mixtures and things like that that can occur. And the only way you're going to identify these is through a grow out of the commercial variety, you know, prior to selling it to anyone else. Another important feature of your seed supplier that you want to go with is somebody who has a very active breeding program. See, this is critical because this crop is young. There's a lot of domestication still to be done, a lot of improvements that can take place. There's a great deal of genetic variability to work with, and having a really solid breeding program run by a well-trained and experienced breeder is a key to success. Now, we at Kayagene have an excellent breeding team that we lean on, you know, with experience not only in hemp but in other crops, and knowledgeable in not only classical breeding skills but also in the newest breeding techniques. Another point you want to ask your seed supplier is, do they have an active trialing program? You know, and why is that necessary? You know, because, so let's say myself, as breeding here in Florida, I have no idea whether a variety I develop here is going to produce well in the Midwest or not. The only way you're going to find out is take those materials, put them into trials with growers so that we can not only view them ourselves and gain data on them, but also take into account what the growers are saying. What do they see of value or weaknesses in the varieties? You know, this is something we do on a national scale here with Kayagene. We have trials all over. We compile data. You know, we use it to make our breeding decisions and commercialization decisions. And we can also use it to help growers understand how the variety may do in their own backyard. So this is something that we do on a regular basis. And when it comes to new experimentals, we need to get those out to get looked at. And that data helps drive our decisions to move those varieties forward and which ones will go commercial. You might also need to ask, or you should, you know, is your seed supplier willing to provide information, you know, after the seed sale? You know, we ran into several situations where, you know, a person was only around for the seed sale. They were hard to reach after. You know, growers have questions, hopefully not complaints, but they have questions. And it's nice to be able to have somebody that is going to answer the phone and do their best to provide you with information. And here at Kayagene, we have excellent trained agronomists that are very willing to help growers to succeed by answering questions, providing information that we have. And if we don't have it, we'll do our best to help you find those answers for yourself. You know, this gives us a very strong grower orientation and one that we're proud of. The last item here I have is, does your potential seed supplier have a track record of reliable varieties and reliable seed performance? Here you can ask, you know, fellow growers, you know, that information gets around, you know, it's out there. So take the time to do that. You know, this will alleviate, you know, a lot of potential problems by making a wrong decision. You know, it isn't necessarily going to be the price or the, you know, the smooth talk in some cases, but it should be based on all of these key features, which are so important to having a good crop yourself. Okay, the next step is, if you've defined, you know, who you want as your seed supplier, okay, what is going to be the right variety for you? Okay, this is very important that you sit down and take the time to consider what is your target customer in the market. So in the left photo, you know, we've got some nice picture of flour that would be for smokable flour, you know, trimmed, and it's important. So if this is the direction you're going to go, you need to pick a variety that's going to work for this. One that has a nice firm bud with the right dimensions and is going to supply, a good amount of that. You may be willing to forego a bit of the biomass overall because, in essence, that's not really the market you're going for. Now, if you want to look at the biomass market, which also has a couple of different segments to it, different grades to it, then you're looking at something that is you might not care very much about how the actual flower looks, but really whether or not this produces a high level of biomass and good CBD in order to reach what you need to have for this market. And here, we show a couple of the different grades. So, it's definitely, less valuable, but, this may be the direction you want to go. Also, part of choosing the right variety, as I said here, you need to plan for your needs. We just talked about having the appropriate target customer and market chosen, and of course, if you haven't taken the time and finally you decide later on, you would like to go to the flower market, but yet you've chosen a variety that's probably better for biomass, you might not be able to provide what your customer is needing from you. So you got to take the time to make sure that you do that, like we just said. Also, particularly for this year is, are you going CBD or CBG? CBG seems to have, kind of the big push or some interest, mainly because there hasn't been much of it produced. A lot of CBD is out there in terms of biomass, but you got to figure out exactly where it is you're going with yours, which cannabinoid is going to be of interest. And as we move further, there's going to be other cannabinoids that you might want to address. Next, you got to decide what direction you're going to go in terms of plant type. Is it going to be autoflower or full term? Now, we talked about this in a previous webinar, but let me make a couple of the comparison points for those people who may not be as aware of the features of these different types. So the photoperiod sensitive, often called the full term, versus an autoflower day neutral type, basically growing like a tomato plant. These are the two basic types we're talking about. In terms of harvest time, a photoperiod planted in the spring, say June, is going to be a fall harvest, whereas a day neutral type planted similarly will be a mid to late summer harvest. In the case of the photoperiod sensitive types, it's definitely a longer crop versus what you're going to get for the day neutral autoflower. The photoperiod sensitive types are the classic larger plant and thicker stem, kind of the Christmas tree looking effect, whereas the autoflower are short with a high ratio of flower to stem. In our trials that we've run, this ratio can be upward of 80%. In the case of a photoperiod sensitive, of course, we just said they're bigger plants, so you're going to have fewer plants per acre, ranging from a couple thousand to maybe 10,000 plants per acre, whereas an autoflower is definitely going to be higher density. They're smaller plants, so you're looking at, like a 10 to 20,000 plant per acre density. So then the planting times appropriate for these are somewhat different. For the photoperiod sensitive, in terms of like a June planting or maybe a July planting versus, the autoflower, which depending on where you're at could be April through June, or in some cases, say here in the Southeast, we're looking at times earlier than that, maybe into February and March as well. Overall, our feeling at Kayagene is that, we're not of one type or another. They both have an excellent place. And we'll mention a couple of ways you can utilize these in specific ways going forward here. But you can use it in several ways in order to spread out your labor, spread out your harvest window. Go with an autoflower early so that you can capture some of that going in. Use your labor that way, and then come follow up with the full term variety to finish off your season. And then in addition to all of this, you need to look at the maturity. Within the photoperiod sensitive and within the autoflower types, there are maturity differences, early versus late, allowing you to, stage your crops. These are some things you can keep in mind. All right, next part in choosing the variety, and really, the last part here, is understanding the performance of the variety in your area. So, that's where I say the importance of a trialing program and working with a company that is going to provide data, like us in Kayagene, we have a national program in trialing. We may not be right in your backyard, but we are, in many, many places, so that we can share some of the data that we have on how a variety may do in your particular area. The data should be able to be supplied by the seed supplier. You want to be able to ask them. This is the picture here on the right, the plot shows a little bit of results from some trial work that we did last year, because we're also looking at optimizing our varieties, in terms of plant density. So what you can see on the x-axis is just plant densities going from 4,667 up to a little over 8,000. And what we have seen is that with the gray line and the black line, they are for plant weights, dry weights versus floral dry weights on a per plant basis, and those decline as the density increases. But what is of real interest is the orange line, which steadily increased through these trials, showing that the yield per acre on these autoflowers consistently increased. Very important in terms of optimizing what you can get out of your crop. So other sources of information in understanding variety performance, other growers may have tried the variety that you're considering going with. Extension service results, and the university trials can be also valuable, even though the university trials are not necessarily in growers' fields, but they normally involve several varieties, so you can get some comparison on how one might do over another, not necessarily an overall yield, but maybe some features that you might like to be able to pick out by seeing several varieties all together. Okay, once we've done our job in choosing a good seed supplier as well as a good variety, is establishing the crop. Now, there's several things involved in crop establishment. I only want to bring out a few, especially in regard to the day neutral varieties, simply because we run into those. They're a little bit, more difficult to work with, but not so much. They can be transplanted or they can be direct seeded. Now, this slide shows results with some transplanting issues. So that the day neutrals need to be transplanted within about 14 days from sowing. Otherwise, if you let them go longer, 21, 28, up to 30 days, you're going to start to see plants flowering in the trays even. And the end result of that is, of course, they're not going to continue to grow, and they're going to be stunted, and you're not going to get much of a yield. So
can I add to that too, Steve?
Oh, absolutely, sure.
Yeah, so one thing we've also noticed is that there's a key thing in autoflowers that a lot of people overlook, and that's the heat units and how they influence the vegetative growth pattern of this type of cultivar. And what we've noticed is the more heat units that are applied, especially very aggressively and rapidly in a stressful heat situation where you might even be hitting 95 to 105 degrees, and within that range, I think they start to accumulate heat units very quickly. So whether it's a black tray or black plastic mulch on a small plant that just got transplanted, these things are things you want to look out for, because this particular cultivar likes to be cool during its juvenile stage to ensure its proper veg pattern. If it doesn't stay cool, and if it overheats during that youth stage, then what it does, it kind of tells itself it's time to finish, it's time to start flowering, and therefore you miss out on those key points of growth, and the plant doesn't really get to the size that you'd like it to. It doesn't really build that frame.
Well, excellent points, George. Thank you very much for adding that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, on these, what I wanted to point out in the photo on the left is a plant grown in a standard plug mix, and what they look like after 14 days. So obviously, the plug mix concept is to allow the root system to hang on to the medium, with the intention that at some point you can pull the plant and it'll pull clean from the tray. Well, at 14 days, hemp does not have the kind of a root system necessary to allow that to happen. So really you need to move into another system. And so on the right is an example of the Workman. This is a 10-day-old plant, and you can see with that little mesh material there that this plant is ready to go, but it's not requiring the plant to hang on to the mix, but instead the Workman itself is taking care of that for you. There are other systems that I'd like to point out as well. And so we talked about the Workman, but there's also the Elipot, the Jiffy Performa plugs, the Earth Pots, Oasis plugs, Quick plugs, And right now, I think the LE pots seem to be getting a bit more of the interest that we're hearing about. But these are all good systems if you want to go with transplanted autoflower. Now, again, the autoflowers can be direct seeded, and we're promoting that concept from the standpoint that we want to see the production cost decreased. And with a direct seeded crop, of course, you get by all of the transplant costs, and and it can work out extremely well. One of the things that are important to note, though, is that hemp requires a very good quality seed bed. It can't be full of debris. It can't be full of clods. You want to have a nice friable soil for sowing into. And then, of course, one of the issues is planting depth. We normally look for about a 1/4 inch to maybe up to a 1/2 inch planting depth, and then requiring proper material in terms of precision planters for the planting equipment. You can't go quickly because you're planting at such a shallow depth. Any of the planter bounce, you'll end up with some seed on top of the soil, and that of course isn't going to help your stand. So taking the time, going slowly, making sure you've got proper depth of planting are all key, but also the soil moisture. Soil moisture from the standpoint, at that top 1/4 inch, sometimes difficult to keep it all at the right level of moisture, but you do need to until you can get that plant established. Also, there's issues with potential crusting. Hemp does not do well with a crust as far as breaking it, so proper irrigation, whether it's sprinkler or you can do drip as well, just keeping that top little bit from crusting over, and you can get your crop established. So it's, like I said, it's not real rocket science. And this picture on the right is a great example. This is from this year, a planting in Yuma, Arizona, of one of our autoflower varieties, the Pipeline, on a 40-inch bed with 2 rows and 1 foot spacing between plants. As you can see, it's beautiful, and so it clearly can be done. It's just taking the time to do things properly.
It's the best utilization of space from what we've seen, and we've seen it's pretty common to see wasted space in the hemp sector. So I think one of the things that really would benefit growers is to look at how big the plants get based on the time that you're planting them. Like Steve was saying, it can change. So the variety on the left here is Maverick in this photo, and the variety on the right is Pipeline. And both varieties are like the one on the left, Maverick, is 85 days to maturity in this photo, and then on the one on the right is 75 days to maturity. Now, if you were to plant this in cool soils, colder soils in northern latitudes, like in Oregon, that might be a 95-day variety on the left and an 85-day variety on the right. It might bump up 10 days, maybe even more, depending on how early you plant. And so that just goes to show how the hue units play a role in the way that these genetics function in various environments.
Great. So once you've established your crop, of course, now we're going through the season, and so I have to mention something about disease and insect control. Now that could be an entire webinar series in itself. And one of our previous webinars did cover integrated pest management and insect and disease. So encourage you to go back into our archives, take a look at that one, when you have your time. So I'm not going to go into great depth. Some of what I saw in terms of what was common problems was first the caterpillar, you can see, and then below that botrytis, and then to a lesser extent was southern blight. And so what I'm suggesting here is, if in working with the hemp, is try to understand what are common problems in your area, or what are common problems that growers have in general, and then try to be prepared for those. I know of a situation last year where, say, well, I don't think we can spray much, I don't think we can do much. And, in case of a couple of growers, they didn't prepare. And so when faced with something like, botrytis or, caterpillar, they weren't prepared for what to do, and then they were, scurrying around to resolve problems and in a curative fashion, whereas maybe a little bit of extra effort or looking into things might have helped. For example, there are some things, talking to some organic growers, we do know that some of the parasitic wasps can do a great job to control the caterpillars, and products like the Millstop, which is just potassium bicarbonate, can work well to control some of the botrytis, both in a protective and a curative fashion. So these things can do a great job. Each of the states are reviewing what chemicals and things will be able to be used, whether it's BT products and things like that. So, by all means, spend the time to do a little bit of research before asking people, see what can work, before you actually need it. And lastly, regardless, practice integrated pest management. I mean, there's nothing that's better than scouting your fields, understanding problems before they're coming of major consequence. And, it is the key to success. Okay, with a crop in the field, one of the other big problems is pollen in the field. Now, males are not hard to identify. The flowering structure is quite different from the females. This picture I have here shows it's a hermaphroditic plant, but basically you can see the male flowers form there. So they're not difficult to spot, and you just need to realize that that they can be there. So, what's one of the ways of preventing having males in the field? And that would be choosing the right genetics. That we saw that many times. I, talked to some growers where, he's saying, well, I was told this should have no more than 1% males, and we counted 36% in his field, when things all came out. So, choosing the right seed supplier, again, going all the way back to the beginning of this webinar, you can't do too much work in that regard. It'll definitely pay benefits down the line. Another aspect is communicating with your neighbors. I ran into a situation last year. One grower had a gorgeous crop going, all females, looked beautiful. He had there was another field, a different grower down a ways, not so lucky, had gotten some seed of a variety that did have males in it. Both of the growers were getting pollinated and, ended up with some real troubles. Now, other situations, I think, George, in a previous discussion we had, you were talking about how growers happen to work together in a situation that you experienced. Is that right?
Oh yeah, and there's been a grower in Oregon that got some bad seeds, and the neighbor noticed that they kind of walked away from their field, and so they realized that the grower made a big investment on seed and might have lost out and might have had a really unfortunate situation. So that rather than both of their crops get ruined due to the negligence, that the one grower that still had the good crop actually took the time and effort to go rogue the field of the males next door, and what ended up happening from that was that he preserved his own crop.
That's excellent.
Took matters into his own hands.
Right. Yep. That's what's needed in some cases. At least communicate, but sometimes you have to chip in, right?
Yep. Okay. That's a great point, Steve.
I wanted to point out here that you need, as a grower, you need to recognize that hermaphrodites can occur in feminized hemp. It is feminized, but there is a percentage that can take place. Now, in our case, we're saying that we're getting 99.9% females, so that means 1 in 1,000 potentially could be hermaphrodite male. Now, the one thing with hermaphrodites that we have seen is sometimes those male flowers don't produce much pollen. Sometimes they don't produce any pollen, and sometimes it can be just one branch on a plant, that does that. But you need to be aware, that even with really good feminization, you'll have some small numbers. And I think, George, you were telling me some of your experience so far this year, we were looking even better than 1 in 1,000. Is that right?
Yeah. I think in some cases we got as good as 1 in 4,000. So those are, that's usually the lowest benchmark. You don't want to go fall much below 1 in 1,000.
Right.
I think kind of industry standard is 1 in 2,000, and if you're really exceeding standards, then you'll be in that 1 in 4,000 mark. So, yep, I think that's kind of what we're all shooting for there.
Yeah. Okay. The next thing I wanted to bring up is, as a grower, you want to identify sources of feral hemp. Now, that isn't for everyone necessarily. Areas that have been in the past have grown a lot of the fiber hemp. That's going to be commonplace. And those are going to be on ditch banks and everything else. And we've heard in some cases where growers are saying, hey, one option for me is to use an autoflower early, because that way I can be finishing my crop about the time this pollen starts to go. And in fact, with the one grower I talked to in my situation who got pollinated by the other fellow, it was his interest to say, hey, for me, I think I might start my season with autoflowers, because then I'll be assured of having at least, a really decent crop of the autoflower, just in case something happens with my full terms. So it's important to note about the feral hemp that could be in your area. And in addition to feral hemp, it's volunteer hemp. So again, going back to my grower example, the two guys that got pollinated, had seed in the field, and that's going to come up, and that's going to be volunteer sources. So you want to clean that up, from year to year. So your best bet would be to, move to a different field so you can come back in and totally clean up when there's a problem with volunteer hemp. And the last thing is, I can't stress it enough, is walk your crop. The males or hermaphrodites, when they do show up, they don't show up all at once. So, today, tomorrow, you think you're done with them, and they'll show up a little bit later. So it's important to keep walking the crop, keep an eye on it, and that'll save you a great deal. Okay, now as we're coming to the end of the crop, having high THC at harvest is a potential problem, but can be, managed well. We do know that essentially all of the high CBD varieties are capable of THC levels in excess of 0.3%. In the example I have here, this is from some research done at the University of Florida. If you look at the top graph, it shows the total THC plotted as a percentage, plotted against the weeks after flowering was initiated. And in the lower graph, you can see the total CBD percentage plotted against the same number of weeks. And this is occurring for 3 different varieties of full-term hemp. The important thing to see here is that when the THC level was reaching the critical 0.3%, it was only about 4 weeks into flowering. Another thing to notice is once it passed that point, even though the one variety in green declined, it never comes compliant again. It's finished. And the other thing in the lower graph to notice is that at that 4-week level, where the THC is still making compliance, your CBD level is not going to be all that high. In this case, it was maybe 7%, maybe 8%. It's important to recognize that. The numbers we've heard in terms of CBD that were high would have been on crops that would not be compliant with a total THC level of 0.3%. So it's important to know, what is the THC compliance level definition for the state you're in. There are several that are still working with the 2014 levels, so they're looking at Delta 9 only. And so in a case of these graphed materials here, the Delta 9 would still be quite low when these things were reaching their maximum high levels of CBD. But when you take into account the total THC, it's much earlier. So another thing I should mention is to keep in mind is that for a full-term variety, your flower development, 4 weeks into flowering is not going to be what you would like to see, but it's what you need to live with in order to maintain compliance. So what we're recommending is at least weekly sampling of the flower material so you can see the development of the THC. It's key for you to do that in order to maintain compliance. And if you look at in this particular graph, they went from 0.2% THC at 2 weeks, to the point, in his case, about 0.35 in 4 weeks. So, they were moving at a 0.1, 0.15 level per week. So that can be, rather rapid. So with that sampling, what we're suggesting is that you set your THC benchmark and follow it. So in other words, if you think you can get the state out to do the final evaluation, maybe you make the call when you're reaching a 0.2 level, maybe 0.25, but it's got to be your call when you think, if you try to push too hard, you may go over and there's no coming back. So the important thing is establish that benchmark and stay on top of it with the sampling. All right, the next problem, now this would be after harvest, is no outlet for your product. And in this case, what we're suggesting is have a contract. If you're going to go biomass CBD oil, have that contract before you plant. And the impact of not having a contract is you may be sitting on biomass for a long period of time. slow to recoup your costs and gain your profits in it. In addition, you want to take the time to find a processor that you can work with. It's really important. You don't have to go with the first one. There are several good processors out there. You're looking at a combination of, how they work, their reputation, and that sort of thing, as well as the contracts they might be putting out there. And so, that combined with having the right contract that'll work for you. So the right processor and the right contract. I'm no legal person, by any means. And so it's important to look around and talk to people about what has worked for them. I've been impressed with North Carolina State University Extension Service. Both last year, 2019 and 2020, they put out these documents, discussing, understanding and evaluating concepts. A good place to start in understanding this whole process and kind of getting your feet on the ground. The last thing I want to bring up here is understand that this is a very dynamic and changing market. I use the adage from the finance industries of, past performance is no guarantee of future results, and that is absolutely true. We're seeing so many changes. If I go back to my vegetable days, if a farmer was going to take on a new vegetable in an area, and my suggestion would be, I'll start with some small acreage, see how it sells. Next year maybe do the same. Maybe the third year, if it's looking good, you can increase. But I saw that somebody do exactly the same thing in hemp. This was in 2017. They went small, they were profitable. 2018, they were small, they went profitable. 2019, they pushed it a bit and were not so profitable. But what you need to take into account in that whole thing is, maybe with the vegetable example, the market was actually fairly constant. You might have been the first guy in the market in your territory, but it was reliable. This is changing a lot. New states have been coming into the market. New products, whether it's the smokable flower, things like CBG versus CBD are coming in. And so in that graph on the right, that represents the spot pricing of the biomass hemp, starting last year and how it finished up at in January of 2020. So, the important thing there is you got to recognize this is a dynamic market. You got to stay on top of it. You can't just, because it worked for me last year means it's going to work for me this year. And, by other means, if it wasn't so good last year, it doesn't guarantee that it won't improve in the following year. So in summary, I have enjoyed delivering this message, and I hope it was enjoyable for you as well. I hope you got a few good take-homes out of this. I tried to talk a bit about the importance of, the seed supplier and having the right genetics. To me, that's really key. And then, of course, some basic issues on, crop establishment, that I've seen people have trouble with, but there are, easy remedies for. We're always going to be dealing with insect and disease controls. And field pollinations are always going to be a potential hazard. You really need to, with the regulations of total THC, you need to be able to monitor your THC levels so you can maintain the compliance of your crop. And, you got to look at things that'll help you be profitable with an outlet for your harvested material. So also lastly, like I just finished saying, you got to recognize this is a very dynamic market. We think there's a lot of potential here. And you just need to stay on top of it in order to be successful.
Thanks so much, Steve. So we want to just really congratulate Bill Brammer for winning the 100,000 seeds here. He was the 8th registrant on our giveaway, on our attendee list, and we randomly select the 8th contestant as the winner. So congratulations, Bill. We'll be in touch with you on how to pick up your seeds and how we can help you get those to reach their full genetic potential this year in your area. It sounds like you're growing in San Diego, California. So yeah, just thank you very much, everybody, for participating. This will conclude our first series of webinars. Please look out for the next series to come as the crops are being grown this year, and it'll be more in tune with cultivation practices that are being changed, and we really want to focus on things that are stereotypes that are being broken, boundaries that are getting pushed, things like this. I think that's where our next series will lie. So kind of stay tuned for the next blocks, and we'll be sending you all an email invitation to join us again. And Can't thank you enough, Steve. That was very well articulated, and I think your several years experience in history gives you a unique eye to this industry. And we look forward to having you on here again and sharing your thoughts and experiences with the folks here.
Great, thank you. I look forward to being back.
Okay, we'll see everybody. Bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye.